Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our Cancer Conversation series brought to you by UNC Lineberger's Comprehensive Cancer Center. My name is Jennifer Potter and I'll be your moderator today. Our presentation today will be all about the relationship between your body's genes and cancer. We're delighted to have Julianne O'Daniel with us today. She's an assistant professor at UNC and an experienced genetic counselor. I wanted to bring your attention to the fact that at the bottom of every screen you'll see an email address. Please email us questions throughout the presentation. We are going to leave time at the end for any questions you may have about this very compelling topic. And also wanted to let you know that if you have any technical questions about connectivity or sound, please call us during the presentation at 919-445-1000. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Julianne.
Hi, thanks to everyone for joining us today. So this is a question and a topic that at least I frequently get within my family whenever we have get-togethers. And just for today, this is a broad topic, and I'm going to talk about family history in general, and then focus on cancer. And I encourage everyone to ask questions. If you have personal questions, you can reveal as much information as you want, but do realize these will be asked online and to the group. And also, you're welcome to send me any additional questions afterwards, if it is too personal or too specific to your family. Okay, so to get us started, we're going to be talking just in general, just some genetics basics to get us all on the same page in terms of some of the words we're using and some of the concepts, and we'll kind of use this throughout today. Then we're going to get into more about family history and how we draw it, what patterns we're seeing, what we mean by a cancer family history, and then what would be next steps if you're concerned about having cancer or another health condition in your family. So just to get us started, I know we can't really do a brainstorming out loud, but to help you think about what might come to mind when we say just genetics or that something's inherited. And usually when I'm with a group and they ask this, it might be babies and prenatal visits. Sometimes people are thinking about X-Men and mutants. They may be doing ancestry testing, which is very popular these days. People may think it's all experimental and futuristic. And some people may look at me like, I'm really not sure. But for today, we definitely want to start thinking about family history when we're talking about genetics. And that's anything that can run in the family. And we'll get into more about what that means. And also things that are inherited and passed down from generation to generation. So to start us off with some basics. When we say genetic code, and sometimes you'll hear someone say the genome, but I'm going to call it genetic code. And we have our little, by our DNA strand up here. So it is our set of instructions for our bodies to grow and function in a very simple overview. It's written as DNA, and in fact, when you're looking at that strand, these little pieces, connector pieces here in the middle, it looks like a staircase that's been twisted. Those are the little DNA pieces and how they pull together. So those DNA letters, there's about 3.2 billion DNA letters in our genetic code. And we get one version of our genetic code from our moms and one from our dads. So we have two copies of our genetic code. Now continuing on, so this code is in virtually every cell in our bodies. People tend to think about it in terms of passing it on to our next generations, our egg cells and sperm cells, but it's really in virtually every cell of our body with just a few exceptions. And that when we think about our biology and our bodies and our cells replace themselves. It's a natural process. They make new generations of cells. We call them daughter cells. And that's a very good process. It keeps us healthy and young looking. People are always trying to figure out ways to replenish and make our cells healthier. But when those cells replace themselves, when they replenish, our genetic code must be very, very carefully copied for each generation. And as you can imagine, with a genetic code that's 3.2 billion DNA letters long, typos happen. These are just kind of genetic mistakes, for lack of a better term. And most of the time, these mistakes are actually okay. Our body can tolerate them. And part of that is because of this concept of genes. And a gene, other than what we might wear on Fridays, is a piece of DNA. So it's a defined section in our genetic code that has a very specific instruction. Now our bodies have about 20,000 genes in our genetic code, which is a lot less than some other animals and organisms on the world. And what's an interesting fact is only about 2% of our genetic code is actually a gene. So that means 98% of our genetic code is not an instruction. It does a whole bunch of other things. Sometimes I like to think of it as if the genes were books in a library, maybe the rest of our genetic code could be the bookshelves, the librarians, and maybe that Dewey Decimal System or the computer that's helping us find those books. And of all those 20,000 genes, we're still linking genes to specific human conditions. And there's only about 5,000 that are linked to specific inherited genetic conditions. So what do we mean by genetic condition? So when I say that term, I'm meaning that either all of the symptoms or most of the symptoms are completely, or for the most part, caused by a difference in a particular gene. So it could be that that entire gene is missing, it could be that that gene has been duplicated, or it can mean that just a single DNA letter has been swapped out. And an example that I use is recipes. So whenever I think of instructions, I think of my most favorite instruction book is My Joy of Cooking. And my husband always laughs because I don't like to follow recipes as instructions. I use them as guides. But our bodies, they follow our gene instructions to the letter. They follow exactly what they say. And so this is a very overly simple, view of a recipe of a cake. So you have your ingredients on one side, you have your very simple instructions. Sorry, don't actually try to make a cake based on this, on the other. If this were a gene instruction, then you could imagine that if I changed any piece of this instruction, we'd get something different. If I replaced sugar and put in the same amount, but it was salt, I might still get a cake. It just wouldn't taste very good. Or what if I said, after we preheat the oven and get out our instructions, we're done. We're not going to have a cake at all. And so based on how that gene instruction is changed, we might get a different outcome. And those are the different genetic conditions that we talk about, because some of these changes to these gene instructions can be inherited. Now, I love genetics. I study genetics, that's my work, but it's not always the main part to our health conditions. So all health conditions do have a genetic factor to them or a genetic part to them, but most of the time it's just one small factor among a whole bunch of other things. So I think that's important to keep in mind, especially when we talk about cancer running in the family, that genetics may only be a small part of that total cancer risk. In some families, it's a very important part, and it may be a large part. So we're going to talk about how to figure out which one it is and what we do about it. So a way that I like to think about how health and conditions come up is I think about this scale here, where on one side we have our health side, and the other side we have illness. And down here I talk about how there's really multiple factors or things that can add up to either contribute to the healthy side or the illness side. So you can imagine we have genes that contribute to having good health, and we may have some genes that can contribute to being a risk factor for a condition or an illness. Then we have everything else that we do in life. We have eating healthy and exercise, we have healthy lifestyle and moderation, and we have abundance. And I say I have absolutely nothing against Dunkin' Donuts. In fact, I love donuts, but maybe we shouldn't eat the whole box. So all of our life, we have all these exposures which can add up and contribute to health or illness. And we use this fancy term multifactorial. In fact, most of our health conditions are multifactorial, and genetics is just one of those factors. When we think about family history, it's a fantastic tool. And one of the reasons is because it can actually shed some light on these multiple factors and how they combine across a family. Now you may wonder, how does that work? So with a family history, it's showing both shared factors and individual factors across a family. So what we share with our family, we share genetics in common with them just based on biology and that we're related to them. We also share our physical environment. That'd be the location where we grew up. That could include things like if we live near a river, we live out in a forest where we have lots of fresh air, or if we grew up in a very urban environment, if we grew up on a farm and were exposed to different either pesticides or chemicals or animal byproducts. It's our lifestyle. We tend to share our lifestyle in common with our family, how we eat, how active we are, whether we grew up in a family where everyone smoked, or if we grew up in a family where there are lots of substance abuse. So we share a lot of things that are not just genetics with our family members. We also have a lot of individual choices. We're not completely products of our families, but we have personal choices about work, where we live, our lifestyle. And then there's also just chance. There's things that happen in life that we can't predict and that have no biologic factor involved. So when we look at a family history, what we're really doing is we're searching for patterns. I have our little crystal ball. We can kind of look at family history, and it is a bit of an art. But in terms of health conditions, some of the questions we're asking and some of the patterns we're looking for are really how many people are affected. Unfortunately, cancer is very common, and so it's actually unusual to have a family history where there's no one affected. We also want to see how are people related. So if you have individuals in a family, are they related by marriage? And thus, those two affected people don't share genetics in common? Or are they all on the same side of the family and they're related and they share genes and perhaps a risk factor in common? How old are the individuals when they were diagnosed? And do they have other known risk factors like smoking or other exposures, asbestos or factory work, that might have contributed to those health conditions? Now, when we draw a family history, we draw it out in this pedigree form. And, sometimes I'll say pedigree and people are thinking about dog food or other animals. But this is how we draw them out. And it's a simple way for us, at least in the clinic and with your doctors, to see patterns. And you might have fun with this as well. So when we look at this, the circles here are females. The squares are the guys. And you can see that these different lines mean things. So when we draw a line directly connecting two people, that's a partnership line. When we have lines coming down, that would be their children, their offspring. Siblings are connected like this. And we have other little symbols, and we'll use a diamond to indicate that it could be either male or female. And sometimes we'll use that just for shorthand to keep things easy on ourselves. Now these will also fill in different individuals in a family history that might have a similar condition. And we can then see, is there a pattern in the family? And we can use the same very basic thing to make it a little bit bigger. And this can show us how people are related. And this, now we're going to get into how you impress your relatives at your next family get-together. So we'll often talk about close family members, or what we say first-degree relative. Now, in here there are pink relatives. The easiest way to remember is these are the people that you are connected directly to, and you don't have to go through another relative. So these would be your children, your brothers and sisters, your siblings, and your parents. Now, a second-degree relative means you've had to go through a first-degree relative to get to them. So that would be your nieces or nephews, your aunts and uncles, and your grandparents, because you had to go through one first-degree relative to connect you back to them on this pedigree that we've drawn out here. Now, why is this important for us to know? Is that we share roughly 50% of our genetics with our first-degree relatives. And it's cut in half every time you go further out. So our second-degree relatives, we share roughly 25%. So if there's a cancer risk that we have, there's a 50-50 chance that our first-degree relatives would have that same risk. 25% for our second-degree relatives. And so that's why knowing how closely people are related can give us clues. Now, if you really want to impress your relatives, this is a chart, and I just put this in here for fun. So if you ever download it and want to look, and you've ever heard about people talking about first or second cousins once or twice removed, there actually is a rhyme or reason to this. And so that's what this chart is going through. And I'm not going to really get into any detail, but I thought I'd add it just so you can see that this is actually, that there is a pattern for this, and we use this in family histories to, again, look at how closely people are related and what genetics they may share in common. So now let's get back to our main question. What does a family history of cancer actually mean? Now, as I mentioned, cancer is unfortunately really common. And some of the broad estimates is that about 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 people will have or a diagnosis of some type of cancer, including skin cancers like basal cell or squamous cell cancers in their lifetime. Now, most cancers occur later in life, and all cancers have both genetic and non-genetic factors. And we'll talk a little bit more about these. Most of the time, there's not one single main factor in a cancer's development. It's a combination. It's that multifactorial process that we were talking about with multiple factors. And so let's get a little bit more into that. So here, I love, those of you that are fans of old TV, the I Love Lucy show. And she had a show where they were trying to work a factory. And I always think it was a candy factory. I think it's a good example of what I'm going to talk about with Cancer Basics. You may remember I was talking about how cells replace themselves. We call that cell growth, when they're creating this next generation of daughter cells. And that's a very normal process, but it also needs to be very, very well controlled because of the possibility of creating a lot of genetic mistakes. And all of these control genes, well, sometimes we call them cancer genes when they're not doing their job. And when one or more of those specific control genes can't do their job, that cell growth can go unchecked, and that's when a cancer can develop and those genetic mistakes accumulate. Now back to this Lucy show, those that remember it, they were working at a chocolate factory. And as the candies came down the line, the ones that they were messing up on, they initially tried to all stuff in their mouth to hide the mistakes. Well, eventually they had no more room, and the candy went everywhere. And so when we think about that on our biology and our cell level, we can start with normal cells. And a couple mistakes our bodies can tolerate very well, and we really see no effects. But if some of those genetic mistakes end up happening in an important gene, then that is supposed to control that cell process, then those control mechanisms get a little slipperier, and more mistakes may happen. And then more mistakes may happen. It's kind of what people call the snowball effect, and that eventually those controls are lost, and a cancer or a tumor can develop. Now what this means, and I say tumor here, most cancers may have some type of tumor, but not all. And the tumor really is made up of all of these cells that have gone through this process of mistake accumulation. They're growing at a rate that's not like our typical cells. They're not playing by the normal rules, and so they don't look or act like our general body cells. The genetics of the cancer also don't look like our normal cells either. It's not the genetics we inherited. It's the genetics that have happened in that cancer development process. And a lot of clinicians now, especially those in the cancer clinics, may use genetic testing that's specific to the tumor to try to figure out what's unique. What are the genetic changes that are driving the growth of that cancer in order to better treat it? But again, doing genetic testing on that tumor does not tell you about your inherited genetics. It's really about what's different about that tumor and how to treat it. So what is this inherited cancer risk? Well, we were talking about those changes in these important genes, and that might change the gene instruction like in that recipe. Well, some people may be born with a genetic difference in one of these important cancer genes. That doesn't mean that they have a cancer from birth. It just means they have an increased risk over their lifetime to develop one of these cancers. And so these types of differences can be passed down from generation to generation, from parent to child. Now, not always. It can be that it's a new change that happened just in that egg or sperm cell and the genetic code that was in that to form that person. But most often they're passed on in a family. And so we can see some clues in the family history. Now, this is another picture to kind of think about this process. Now, these little blue lines up and down, I'll use my mouse again to show it. So these blue lines up and down, we'll imagine those are each our copies of our genetic code. And the purple line here is our gene that we're focusing on. So we have 2 copies of our genetic code. And so typically at birth, we're born with our 2 copies of our genetic code, and all of our cancer genes are working just fine. Now we go across years and years and years of life, and years and years and years of life, and then over that time we may get some differences, some genetic changes happen in those important genes. And eventually, enough of these might happen that a cancer develops later in life. And that's the typical cancer process that accounts for most cases of cancer. Now, if someone has inherited a change, that means from birth, on that genetic code, in every single cell in their body, they have that difference. That, people call it a mutation or a variation in that specific cancer gene. So that means over life, it just takes less time for enough additional mistakes to accumulate that a cancer can form. And that's really one of the bigger differences, is the time at which or the age at which a person that has one of these inherited cancer risks will develop a cancer, as well as the types of cancers they're developing. So what are the possible signs we'll see? Often in a family, we'll see that multiple family members have the same cancer or related types of cancers. And sometimes the related types of cancers may be obvious. So like breast and ovarian cancer, people tend to think of as female cancers. But colon and endometrial cancer are also related, or breast and pancreatic cancer, or prostate cancer, which can be related to both colon cancer or to breast cancer. The other things that we're looking for are early ages of diagnosis. And we kind of have a general cutoff of around 45 to 50, and so if people are being diagnosed with cancers prior to age 45, we tend to notice a little bit more, or sit up and look more closely. Also, somebody who has multiple cancers in just one individual. So these are multiple separate cancers. So it's if someone has an aggressive or an advanced stage of cancer, their cancer may spread to another organ, but it's still part of that original cancer. But if someone develops a cancer and that cancer is treated, and then they develop a completely separate cancer that's unrelated to the first one, that's what we mean by a separate, or sometimes I'll call it a new primary. Rare cancers, such as male breast cancer or even ovarian cancer, those can be more likely to have inherited cancer risk. And the ovarian cancer is a good example because we know now that about 15% of all individuals who have invasive ovarian cancer may have an underlying inherited cancer risk, so a difference in one of those important cancer genes. Now 15% sounds like a whole lot, and that's why our guidelines offer testing or consideration of genetic testing for these patients. But if you flip that number around, that means that 85% of women with ovarian cancer do not have an underlying inherited cancer risk. Okay. Another sign is seeing cancer diagnosis that seems to be passed from generation to generation. So you'll see it in grandparents and parents and aunts and uncles, as well as in the younger generations and children. And certain ethnic groups may have higher carrier risks. So the group I point out here is the Ashkenazi Jewish population group, that certain genes, the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes, those are two genes that are known for having an increased risk of breast and ovarian cancer, as well as some prostate and pancreatic cancer. About 1 out of every 400 people in the general population may be carrying a difference in one of those genes that causes a cancer risk. In large population studies, we know that people who are from the Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, 1 in 40 may have one of those important cancer risk changes. And so it's a much more common mutation or types of gene changes in that particular ancestry population. It's important to point out that having a 1 in 40 risk still means only 2%, but it's much more common. So what do we do if we find one of these things, or if you happen to be sitting out there going, wow, that really seems to be talking about my family? Well, one of the first things to do is to collect your family health history. Try to write it down. Write down the individuals who were affected and the ages, if you know their diagnosis. If you can get information about their pathology reports. Sometimes these conversations may be a little uncomfortable, but being able to start that conversation with your family members. Once you've collected this, share it with your doctors and your other family members. It's amazing how many times people will do all the work to collect this information, but they keep it to themselves. But it is important for the other people in your family to know it too. And if you're concerned, ask about referral for an inherited cancer risk assessment. So what in the world is an inherited cancer risk assessment? Well, you might come to meet with someone like myself as a genetic counselor in the cancer clinic. We'll talk about your specific medical and family history. We'll discuss whether we think there's a chance that there is a genetic risk in the family, one of these specific gene changes. And then we'll talk about genetic testing and whether we think you or someone in your family could benefit from genetic testing. Often the first thing we talk about is who's the best person to test first. In a family, it's always best to test someone who's been affected by one of the suspicious cancers first. That's not always possible, but if it is, that's generally what we try to do. We talk about insurance coverage and what the cost of that test might be, whether insurance will cover it or not. With genetic testing, specifically genetic testing for inherited cancer risk, there's often criteria, and we can go over those with you. Most insurance companies do cover this type of testing. Large data have shown that more than 50% of patients have zero out-of-pocket cost, and greater than 80% have less than $100 out of pocket. Now, that's not chump change, but it's significantly better than what the thousands of dollars genetic testing used to cost just 5 years ago. The other thing, and really important, is what these results could mean. So, meaning how might it change how your doctors want to treat you if you currently have a cancer, or how they might want to change your screening. Also, what would it mean for family members? And some people are worried, well, could someone use this information against me for discrimination? And there's actually laws that help to prevent that, but we go over that and make sure that everyone is making the best decision for themselves and for their family. So if you were to learn about a genetic risk, what do you do about it? Some families say, I don't want to know that I have a risk for cancer, then I'd just be focused on it. It'd be kind of a doom and gloom type of report. But you actually can do something about this knowledge if you learn it. The biggest thing is to be able to work with your doctors to plan your screening, to make sure that you're getting what you should have for these different risks. So you may remember I talked about that if you have an inherited cancer risk, that your risk for cancer is often earlier than average. That means the general cancer screening guidelines don't really apply, that your cancer risks may start way earlier. So often what it means is you're having enhanced and earlier screening. It also means there could be possible prevention options. Sometimes there's medicines that can help prevent the cancer. Sometimes there's surgical options, such as removal of the uterus, a hysterectomy after family planning, if there's a significantly increased risk for endometrial cancer. Or there's other life planning that you can do. It's always best to start a conversation about how you might want to create a screening or prevention plan when you're not worried about a current ongoing cancer. So this is knowledge that's very helpful to use with your doctors in advance. They say that using this type of knowledge helps you stay 2 steps ahead of the cancer risk and gives you the benefit of time and able to get the information you need to make the best choices for yourself. The other really important thing to do if you were to learn you have a genetic risk is to share that information. You want to share it with your doctors who will be guiding your treatment, but also share it with your other family members, especially all of your close family members who may have a significant risk to have inherited the same thing. This type of information means that they can benefit from early screening and prevention too. It's something that people often forget is that even risks for apparently female cancers can be passed down through male relatives and vice versa. And so it's important to share cancer risk and this type of information with both your male and female relatives. All right, so what about just having cancer in the family, but we don't think it's related to a gene? Remember that our family histories show a lot of the genetic that we share in common, just genetic factors, maybe smaller ones, maybe ones that we don't test for, but just small contributions to our cancer risk, as well as our lifestyle and our physical environment. We know that based on large studies that just having one close family member, that could be a sibling or a parent who has a cancer, slightly increases your risk to get that same cancer. Our general rule of thumb is we say that you should start your cancer screening about 10 years earlier than that close family member's diagnosis. So what does that mean? That means if your mother had breast cancer at age 49, we'd recommend you start your mammography screening around age 39. You can talk with your doctor to see if there's more specific screening or try to really individualize a plan, or you can learn if there's more specific steps you can take. But it's important that if you have any cancer in the family, that you do talk to your doctors and figure out how that information might impact your health. And I know today's talk is all about cancer, but this is important for other health risks as well. If you have a family history of diabetes, heart disease, Alzheimer's, dementia, these same rules apply. Not that necessarily your screening would be that much earlier, but that your risk for you to develop that same condition may be higher than someone in the general population. And so you can talk to your doctor about what are some steps or screening, or if there's anything that you can do to modify in your life that might help to prevent that particular health condition. Now, here at the end, before we take time for questions, I want to leave you with just some information about family history, because that's really one of the biggest tools we're talking about. And family history, I can't say enough, is one of the most powerful tools for preventive medicine. It's really important to collect and share this information both with your doctors and with your relatives. And so these are some of the tools. One is through the Surgeon General. This was made, I think 15, maybe even 20 years ago now. I can't quite remember. It's in a couple of different languages, and it's a place where you can actually collect your family health history online, and you can invite other relatives to add their information. It's all in a private online database at familyhistory.hhs.gov. It's called My Family Health Portrait. It's something that you can actually download and share with your doctors. And I say it's EHR ready, and I apologize that I wrote EHR, which may not be abbreviations, that means electronic health record. I don't know whether your particular medical record would be able to use this information, but it's something that you could share with them, even if you just print it out. There are some additional resources at the CDC at this website. Good. I wasn't sure if it would fit all in one line or not, but it gives you some tools to introduce the idea and have a conversation with your family members about health concerns and how to start collecting them. Some family members may not feel comfortable talking about their health or about past health concerns, and each family is different, and the CDC has some suggestions here to get the conversation started, but I always say, you know your family, and you can always ask the questions, but families are all their own unique beasts. And then with that, I want to thank you all for listening and want to open up to any questions.
All right. Thank you, Julianne, for that amazing presentation. I loved the analogy of baking a cake and recipes to help better understand genetic code. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what a person might experience if their doctor was to refer them to a genetic counselor. Is it a blood test? Is it painful? What can someone expect?
Well, we tend to talk a lot, so it's painful if that's what you mean. But no, it often means that we're going to come, you can either meet face-to-face with someone like myself. Often you may just meet with a genetic counselor. You may meet with a genetic counselor and a medical geneticist or an oncologist. Sometimes there's actually online or telehealth where you're meeting with someone over a computer or on the telephone as well. There's lots of different services. And a lot of it starts with information collection, again, that family and medical history. The genetic testing process, we can get a sample two ways, either by blood, which is just a simple needle stick, and I have to say cancer centers usually have fantastic phlebotomists. Those are the people that draw your blood. So you can either do a tube of blood, or some labs will actually do saliva, which is just spit. It is quite a bit of spit, and if you're grossed out by spitting into a tube about this big, the blood draw may be simpler, but either way works. Most of the labs, they're around the country. There's a couple large genetic labs, and each clinic may choose different labs specific to what genes they want to test. Usually they try to specify the test to that person's either personal or family history of cancer. Testing takes about 3 weeks before you get a result. And then based on that, genetic clinic where you are, they may call out that telephone call you with that result. They may send it to you in the mail. They may schedule an appointment for you to come back in to talk about whether they found anything, and then based on whether they found anything, what are next steps. because obviously if they do find a cancer risk, then there's some planning and next steps that happen. But also if they don't find a cancer risk, having that conversation about how reassured are they by that normal test result, and do they still think there may be a slight increase in your cancer risk just based on the family history and what that might mean.
Thank you. And we did have one question come in, and if you have a question, feel free to email it to us. Someone asked, what is the percentage of some of the more common cancers that are actually caused by genes? I think you touched on this a little bit in your presentation, but for example, what's the percentage of women that have breast cancer that it's actually caused by a genetic change?
Right. Very good question. So if we're still learning a lot, and so all of our current answers are based on estimations. So our best guess is we say about 5 to maybe 10% of all women who have breast cancer may have an underlying genetic risk that was one of the main contributing causes to that risk. Now, some of those genes, like the BRCA1 and 2 that I mentioned, may have a very significant lifetime risk. And by significant, I mean that if someone has one of those mutations or a change, variation of one of those genes, their lifetime risk for breast cancer will be up to about 70%. The average woman in the U.S. has about a 12% lifetime risk of cancer. And so just to show you the difference between those two risks. There are other genes that are out there that if you have a variation of one of those genes, your increase in lifetime risk may be about 25 to 30% over your lifetime. That's still about a doubling of your risk, but how we treat those different cancer risks is different. So it really depends on the gene and the family history. We use family history to see what does that particular gene look like in your particular genetic background in your family.
Okay, we just had another question come in from an audience member. It said, if I had cancer in 2003 and did not have genetic testing, should I go back in and do it now that she's concerned about her daughters and granddaughters?
So if your particular cancer was at a young age, or if it's one of the types, such as ovarian cancer or another more rare type, like a medullary thyroid cancer or any of these others, it's worth considering going back in, even if your cancer was a long time ago. And that said, even if you did have genetic testing, there was some genetic testing available in 2003, but it's usually only involved 1, maybe 2 genes, and it wasn't very comprehensive. It wasn't a very good genetic test. It was the best they had at the time. Our general thoughts is if you had genetic testing prior to about 2010 to 2012, it might be worth considering coming back in to see if new genetic testing, looking at additional genes or using newer technologies, could get a better look at whether you have an inherited cancer risk. Sometimes you may come in and we'll say, no, actually, our suspicion that there's something in the family was pretty low. And so the testing you had before almost completely rules it out. We have very low suspicion. Genetic testing really wouldn't benefit you very much. We could look, but it may not be very helpful. Other times we'll say, actually, we found a whole bunch more genes that might explain what's going on in the family. It's also important, there may be new cancer diagnoses in the family, and sharing that information may help us figure out which genes we should have been looking at.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for submitting your questions. We have 2 more, and I think you may have touched on this a little bit already, but can you talk about the expense and the insurance coverage of testing? And also specifically, is there a genetic test for pancreatic cancer?
Right. So I'll start with the expense. And so for any genetic testing, there's a couple of different expenses. As you all know, we get sometimes several bills when we go to see the doctor. There may be an expense for the actual genetic risk assessment, so the appointment with the genetic counselor or the physician or the doctor, the nurse practitioner, whomever. There may be that appointment cost. Most insurance do cover costs, but you can always check with your plan to make sure that that's something that they consider a covered benefit. Then there's the cost for the actual blood draw. Sometimes that's a very small lab fee, but is something to be aware of, and those can be in the range of $25 to $30, I've heard. Then there's the cost to actually run the test. And running the test, those are generally sent out to labs across the country. There's some on the East Coast and some on the West Coast, not too many in the middle for some odd reason. But those labs, most labs have financial assistance plans to help with the cost of testing. Some labs have cash pay prices, which mean that if based on your family medical history, or if your particular insurance plan says they don't cover genetic testing at all, or you don't meet their criteria for genetic testing, then you can opt to do a cash pay price, which some labs is only $250 out of pocket. And so we'll discuss all those options. Some have, if you have no insurance, then you can apply for their financial assistance, and they do that on sliding scales, and you may have to provide some additional information to show that, or justify what your family income is in order to qualify for those. But most labs want families to be able to get this testing. Many of them have programs so that way once a mutation in a specific gene has been discovered, that then they offer testing for that specific genetic change to all at-risk family members at a reduced cost or even free. So there are programs, and I always say, always ask. Never think that this is going to be too expensive, and I don't want that to be the thing that keeps you out of the clinic. The other question, genetic testing for pancreatic cancer, that's a tough one. So pancreatic cancer can be part of these other inherited cancer conditions. I mentioned that it can be part of a condition where you see a lot of breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and even prostate cancer. It can also be part of conditions where you see colon cancer or GI tract cancer and endometrial cancers. Pancreatic cancer can also just be by itself in families where you just see a lot of pancreatic cancer. In families where there's just pancreatic cancer, we say isolated or just familial pancreatic cancer, we still haven't found the genes that seem to be responsible for that look in family history. So we've done lots of studies. I actually was part of one over 20 years ago in graduate school, not to age myself, where we were trying to find some of these genes. But there's not really good testing for families where the only cancer we're seeing is pancreatic cancer. Sometimes in those families, it turns out it's a risk factor for pancreatic cancer, and there are genes for pancreatitis, which is an inflammation, which can be a risk factor. Now that said, new guidelines have suggested that all people who have pancreatic cancer have genetic testing to get at all of those other genes, the ones that can be part of those colon cancer and endometrial cancer conditions, as well as the ones that can be part of those breast and ovarian and prostate cancer conditions. And so if you're looking at all of those genes, there are about 20-ish genes that could be considered pancreatic cancer genes as part of a broader cancer risk spectrum. So hopefully that kind of answered your question.
Yes, thank you. Well, we are about out of time, but we are not going to ignore any questions that were submitted. Julianne has been so kind with her time, and as she said at the beginning, we'll answer any of the questions that came through that we didn't get to. So you should be looking in your email box for those answers in the next couple hours or so. I wanted to bring your attention to our next Cancer Conversations, which will be February 22nd, and we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about a treatment for cancer called immunology, which uses your body's own immune system to fight cancer. So we hope to see you back then, and thank you for your time today. Thanks again, Julianne.
Thank you for having me, and I definitely send in your questions.
Thank you so much.